teaching that Jesus was crucified and he died, and that 3 days later he rose from the dead, is the core teaching of followers of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul says, "If Christ be not raised, your faith is in vain." So our aim today is to leave aside the thoughts of why Jesus died, and to leave aside thoughts of proving why exactly he rose from the grave. Our aim is more to establish the fact that after he did die, he appeared to many people, and therefore to examine the evidence which suggests that Jesus Christ actually rose from the grave. So it's a very kind of simple and almost like a narrow field that we're going to look at, but it's, as we'll see, it's quite interesting. We will consider the teachings found in the New Testament, which is the New Testament of the Bible, and we will also consider some first century customs and historical data which will help our investigations. So, excuse me, what we'll cover. We're going to have a brief outline of events as described in the 4 Gospels, which are found in the New Testament. We're going to examine 4 fields of evidence, 4 kind of major subheadings, if you like. We'll discuss possible explanations of the evidence which has been put forward by certain people. And finally, we'll draw a conclusion from the evidence which we've discussed. If we can show that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is an historical event, then to those who believe it, faith strengthening exercise, and to those who do not believe it, it will come as perhaps a great surprise that there was so much evidence which points to the fact that it is actually true. So a brief outline of events which happened. The Bible teaches that Jesus taught and preached the Word of God for 3 years. And this was around the beginning of the ADs, so about 0 AD, so 2,000 years ago roughly. And he preached for 3 years, which led to great jealousy of the Jewish leaders at the time. And they set about to get rid of him. And this led to Jesus being crucified on the cross. And these things we probably all know, but I'll just run through them again. So it led to Jesus being crucified on the cross. He actually died. His body was taken from the cross and laid in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And this tomb was guarded by some soldiers. 3 days later, some of Jesus' female followers went to his tomb to anoint his body with spices and ointments, and they found the grave was empty. And they were very perplexed at this. After this initial, and what happened actually, Jesus actually showed himself to these women followers. After this initial appearance to these women, Jesus appeared to many others, both disciples or believers and non-believers, and he was on the earth for 40 days. 40 days before he ascended to heaven is what the Bible teaches. And it was because of this empty tomb story that the Jewish authorities actually persuaded the soldiers who were guarding the tomb. They persuaded them to lie and to say that his disciples, Jesus' disciples, had stolen his body away. So that's kind of a real brief outline of how the story goes from the Bible. What we're going to look at now is 4 fields of examination, which are actually agreed on, and it's important to note this. These 4 things are actually generally agreed on by the majority of New Testament scholars and critics alike. So these 4 things are almost basically without dispute, although some do dispute these things. So the first is that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The second, that on the 3rd day the tomb was found to be empty. The third, that Jesus appeared to many people after the resurrection. And the fourth, we're going to examine the evidence for the changed lives of his followers after his resurrection. And resurrection, when we're talking about resurrection, it just means to raise, to be raised from the grave. So number one, that Jesus, after crucifixion, was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in his personal tomb. There's as we go through these four kind of major headings, we're just going to break it down and just go through several bits of evidence which suggests that this is true. So that's why I've got listed down there 1 to 5 points. So the first point of evidence which suggests that this is true is it's a highly significant fact, as the burial site would have been known to both Jews and Christians alike. So basically, if the burial site's known, Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man and he was actually a member of the Jewish ruling council. If the burial site was actually known, then when the disciples went about proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, everyone would be able to go and check it out for themselves. So it's quite an important piece of evidence which suggests that it actually is true. Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we've got a teaching there which had been passed down from very early on after Jesus' resurrection. And we're going to mention that a little bit later. But in that teaching in 1 Corinthians 15, it actually mentions that Jesus was buried. So the body wasn't just left on the cross, it was actually taken down and put in a tomb somewhere. Third point of evidence is that this teaching about from 1 Corinthians 15 is actually verified by Mark's Gospel. And we'll mention later, we'll go into it a little bit more later, but at the moment I'll just mention that Mark's Gospel was believed to have been the first Gospel to be written by most scholars. And some date it very, very early on after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. The fourth piece of evidence is the fact that Joseph of Arimathea, who is actually, by the way, mentioned in all four Gospels, the fact that he's mentioned at all is highly unlikely if this fact is just made up, or if it's a legendary story, the fact that he's mentioned at all. The reason is because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, or the ruling council of the Jews. And early Christians despised the authorities of the Jewish authorities, because, as we know, the Jewish authorities had plotted to kill Jesus. So the fact that they mentioned the story that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus' body and did in a way a good deed in burying him in the tomb is highly unlikely if it's a figurative story or a legendary story. They would have more likely have gotten one of his disciples to put it in one of their tombs. So it's a highly credible story and points to the fact that it was actually true. And the fifth reason and final reason we'll have a look at is that there's actually no other independent burial stories. No other independent burial stories. Which means that it seems to be, this is actually what happened. If it was a legendary event, there would be most likely differing views on this and differing accounts of where it was buried and who buried him. But all the Gospels and other parts of the New Testament all agree that Jesus was actually buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. I'll just finish this section with a quote from Wilbur Smith in his book Christian Apologetics, and he says, "We know more about the burial of the Lord Jesus than we know of the burial of any single character in all ancient history. We know the very tomb in which his body was placed, the name of the man who owned it, Joseph of a town known as Arimathea. We know even where his tomb was located, in a garden nigh to the place where he was crucified, outside the city walls." So these kind of facts and these kind of historical data indicate that it really is very, very unlikely that it was a fabrication, and in fact Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And you think about it in the first century context, if people knew that this was made up, and the gospel was written so early on after Jesus' resurrection, they would easily be able to go and check these things out for themselves. So it's highly likely that this is actually what happened. Our second section is that the tomb was actually found empty. On the third day, the women, disciples of Jesus, went to the tomb and they found the tomb empty. And some evidence which points to this fact, that the fact that the tomb was found empty was actually part of the early source material of Mark's Gospel. And Mark's Gospel was, as we said, written quite early, and some have dated it to about AD 37, which is only a few years after Jesus Christ was died and rose from the grave. And therefore it just is highly, highly unlikely that it's a legendary event or a legendary writing. A classical historian, A.N. Sherwin, from Oxford University, he studied the rate, he looked back in all classical history, and he studied the rate at which legend accrued in the ancient world, and he concluded that not even 2 full generations, that's 2 full generations, was enough time for legend to develop. 2 full generations was not enough time for a legend to develop and to wipe out a solid core of historical truth. And if we're thinking about that, 2 full generations, Mark's Gospel was written at the very latest, it was within 30 odd years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, but more likely was only within 10 years. So there's nowhere near enough time for this to be a legendary occurrence or saying. Mark's account couldn't be legend and has been dated to AD 37, only a few years after the resurrection. The second point of evidence is that the empty tomb is taught and implied in Paul's teaching of 1 Corinthians 15, which we mentioned earlier and we'll actually look a little bit more at in a few moments. So just believe me on that one at the moment. The third kind of thing which indicates that the tomb was actually found empty was that woman discovered the empty tomb. The woman followers, the female followers of Jesus, discovered the empty tomb. And this is highly, highly unlikely if the tomb or if the story is a fabrication. The reason is because at that time, in first century history, and in the Jewish culture particularly, the testimony of women was regarded as basically worthless. They couldn't and they were not permitted to even stand as a witness in a court of law. So for a woman to go and report that, hey, Jesus' tomb is empty, would have been an embarrassment to the first century Christians. And so for the fact that the Gospels actually record this at all makes it highly, highly likely that woman actually did find the empty tomb. If they were making this story up, they wouldn't have put women finding the tomb, they would have wrote that men found the tomb. So I hope you can follow that point, because it's one of the most pivotal points of the empty tomb discussion. Woman's testimony would have been embarrassing if it was a fabrication, and they wouldn't have written it that way. But all the Gospels write that they actually did find this empty tomb. The fourth and final point we'll consider in this section is that the earliest Jewish teaching taught an empty tomb. The earliest Jewish teaching actually taught an empty tomb. When the Jewish authorities realised there was an empty tomb, they didn't dispute the fact. They didn't say, "Oh no, the disciples are lying." What they did is they paid the guards of the tomb to say that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body. So instead of refuting the fact that the tomb was empty, they actually agreed that the tomb was empty, but they told the guards to say a lie, that the disciples had stolen the body. And so therefore it's highly likely that the tomb was actually found empty. And there's a quote here from Wolfhart Penneberg, and he says, "In Jerusalem, the place of Jesus' execution and grave, it was proclaimed not long after his death that he had been raised. The situation demands that within the circle of the first century community, one had a reliable testimony for the fact that the grave had been found empty. The resurrection proclamation could have not been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned." So what he's saying is, everyone knew where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was. Anyone could have gone and examined the evidence, and what they obviously found was that the tomb was empty. There's no stories arising until a couple of centuries later that suggest that the tomb wasn't empty at all. And so, therefore, it's very, very likely, and in fact I think proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the tomb was actually empty. And sorry, there's quite a lot of points, but we're halfway there, and then we'll just consider some objections or some possible explanations, and then we'll conclude. So it's if you can just bear with me, I find this stuff absolutely faith-strengthening and very, very fascinating. The third section, we're going to consider Jesus' appearances after the resurrection. Jesus' own appearances after the resurrection. The fact that he did actually appear. Jesus appeared to individuals, the New Testament records, individuals and groups of individuals. He appeared to believers and non-believers, to people he knew and people he didn't know. He appeared not just once, but many times, and some of the appearances are confirmed by more than one account. So we have a multiple verification of these things. Second point of evidence is that the list of eyewitnesses given in 1 Corinthians 15 is actually quite remarkable. And we'll just look at 1 Corinthians 15 a little bit. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 7 is an early tradition. And Paul says there, "I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received." So Paul had delivered this message to them, and he'd also received it from somebody. And it's believed that it was actually Peter and James who he received it from. How that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, that he was seen of Cephas, and then of the 12. And the name Cephas there is the Aramaic name for Peter, which is only used just after Christ's resurrection. That he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present. So many of these 500 brethren are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. And he goes on, which isn't really part of this teaching, but he says he was also seen of me, which is Paul. So why is this teaching, and it's called a creed or a tradition, why is this so important? Most people accept it was a teaching that was passed on from very, very early on after Christ's resurrection. 1 Corinthians, the letter, was written in about AD 56, roughly. And Paul says he had already passed this teaching along to them, to the Corinthians. So that would predate, that would mean this tradition that he passed on, and this teaching was predated his first visit, which was about AD 51. So already, that's less than 20 years too early for legend to have developed. Less than 20 years, which is far too early for legend to have developed. If he'd passed this teaching on in AD 51, that's less than 20 years after Christ's resurrection. So it's far, far too early for a legend to have developed. But there's more. Even more impressive, Others actually date this set of teaching to be from 2 to 8 years after the resurrection itself. And this is quite phenomenal, because if you contrast, for example, I heard one just lately about the biographies of Alexander the Great. Actually, the earliest ones that they've found are written 400 years after his death, and no one at all suggests that these things are fabrications or made-up facts. But this could be dated up to between 2 and 8 years after the resurrection, which actually states quite conclusively that Jesus had risen from the grave and had been seen of many disciples and followers of him. And a final point on this 1 Corinthians 15 teaching is that it says that he appeared to 500 people at once. Now this is highly, highly unlikely to be false, as Paul wouldn't write this because so soon after the events. Because, as he says, most of the people were still alive. All the Corinthians had to do was go to one of these 500 people and say, did Jesus actually appear to you? And they would have been able to prove, if it was false, that it was in fact false. So it's highly likely that this is a true account. It was written several years after Christ's resurrection, quite close, and it really adds weight to the fact that Jesus actually did appear to certain people. The third piece of evidence is that many passages, for example 1 Corinthians 15 or Acts chapter 2, they have multiple attestations. So there's multiple kind of records of that this thing actually did occur, that Peter did actually turn up and see Peter and James and such like. So they're confirmed by the Gospels themselves, so it makes it a more credible account when there's two or more stories agreeing and saying exactly the same thing. And this is what Peter actually said. He said, "This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we all are witnesses." So the people that he was talking to were witnesses of the fact, and were witnesses of the fact that Jesus had actually been raised from the dead. They'd seen him after he had supposedly died. Acts 3 verse 15, which is a book in the New Testament, it says there that God killed the Prince of Life, the Jewish authorities killed the Prince of Life, whom God hath raised from the dead, whereof we are witnesses. So they were witnesses to the fact that God had raised Jesus from the dead. And Paul says, a little bit later on, God raised him, Jesus Christ, from the dead, and he was seen many days of them which came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. We are his witnesses unto many people. So he was seen of many days of them which came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. And at one time, as we know from 1 Corinthians 15, there was at least 500 people that saw him. And Jesus was on the earth for 40 days after his resurrection. John Warwick Montgomery, in his book History and Christianity, says, "Note that when the disciples of Jesus proclaimed the resurrection, they did so as eyewitnesses, and they did so while people were still alive, who had had contact with the events they spoke of." In AD 56, Paul wrote that over 500 people had seen the risen Jesus, and that most of them were still alive. It passes the bounds of credibility that the early Christians could have manufactured such a tale and then preached it among those who might easily have refuted it simply by producing the body of Jesus. So it appears beyond dispute, really, that Jesus actually did appear to people after his resurrection from the grave. The fourth point, and I think for me in a lot of ways this is the most impressive, but it's certainly interesting, is that we're going to have a look at the changed lives of Jesus' followers. Excuse me. The changed lives of Jesus' followers. If you think about it, their leader had died. The Jews themselves had no belief of a dying Messiah, let alone one who rose from the dead. So it was kind of a funny story if they were to make this up. The law of Moses had said that he who hangs on a tree is accursed of God. So it was obviously a shame for someone to be accursed of God, and yet these disciples and followers of Jesus fully believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. He was their leader, which just doesn't make sense if they thought, well, he was accursed of God and there's nothing else to it. The second point is that Jewish belief had no explanation of anyone rising from the dead before the resurrection at the last day, or at the end of the world. So for these disciples to suddenly believe that Jesus rose from the dead is quite an incredible teaching. And if you think about it, Jesus was crucified. His disciples were absolutely, their world was turned upside down. They were depressed. They were discouraged. They didn't know what to do anymore, and most of them fled. They just ran away from the sight of the cross, the crucifixion. But then, all of a sudden, after a short time later, they were abandoning their jobs. They gathered together once again, and they started preaching a very specific message. That Jesus, the Son of God, had died on the cross, and he had returned to life and had been seen by them. They spent their lives preaching this very message, and we know what kind of lives they had. It was lives of hardship, often without food, without sleep, in difficult circumstances, travelling over vast distances. They were mocked, they were whipped, and stoned at times, and imprisoned, and many of the disciples actually lost their lives. So, what was the reason for this? What's the... oh, I got something in my throat. Excuse me. What's the main reason for this? What's the best reason that explains this whole thing? It's the fact that they were convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the grave. There's no other kind of thing that's very satisfactory. If they just got together, they were depressed, they were discouraged, thanks very much, and they got together in a room and decided, well, let's make up this story that Jesus is risen from the dead, and we're going to suffer for our lives for it, we're going to be beaten, we're going to be whipped for this fabrication. It's not very likely at all. The best reason is they were convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the grave. What we could say is that we could say the same thing about religious fanatics of any, if you call them fanatics, of any kind of faith. People, like often Muslims, will die for what they believe is to be true. But that's the very point. They believed it to be true with all their heart. They wouldn't be giving away their lives if they thought it was false. And so the fact that these people were actually dying for the cause of Christ points to the fact that they did actually believe that they had seen Jesus from the grave. And it's highly likely that they did. And I've got a quote here from J.N. Anderson, and he says, "Think of the character of the witnesses, men and women who gave the world the highest ethical teaching it has ever known, and who even of the testimony of their enemies lived it out in their lives. Think of the psychological absurdity of picturing a little band of defeated cowards cowering in an upper room one day, and a few days later transformed into a company that no persecution could silence, and then attempting to attribute this dramatic change to nothing more convincing than a miserable fabrication they are trying to foist upon the world. That simply wouldn't make sense." So if this wouldn't make sense, and it seems quite likely that Jesus, his followers were actually transformed, and they had the reason because they had actually seen him risen from the dead. So I've considered this evidence that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, that the tomb was empty after the third day, that Jesus appeared to many of his disciples and followers and other people who didn't believe him also, and finally that the evidence of the changed lives of Jesus' own followers. So what explanations are there to make sense of all this? What's the best explanation? Well, we've considered some of these as we've gone along, but there's the fact that it could be a legendary teaching. But the simple fact that the records are far, far too early to be legend in itself refutes this hypothesis. There's a theory put forward that it could have been an hallucination by some of the people, but it's not likely because all of these disciples actually claim to have had the same thing happen to them, so it's highly unlikely that an hallucination has occurred. Normally an hallucination occurs to one person, and certainly not over a period of time, besides the fact that the verification of the empty tomb and that would refute this. And just as we go through these, I'll just bear in mind again that those 4 points of evidence that we looked at are agreed upon by most New Testament scholars and critics. So they're agreed by most New Testament scholars and critics as being historical facts. Another theory that's put forward to explain these is that Jesus actually didn't die. It's called the swoon theory, and that he actually didn't die. He got crucified, he got laid in the grave, he wasn't actually dead, and then later that night, the cool of the night woke him up, and he walked out of the tomb and appeared to his disciples. But this theory doesn't really hold up either, because it seems highly unlikely that if he was at the point to die and unconscious, that all of a sudden he'd gather the strength to wake himself up with no medical attention, and then somehow get out of his tomb, which is quite an impossible feat, because tombs in those days required several men to remove the stone away. We've considered that it could have been a fabrication, which on many counts has proved to have been false. For example, the woman's testimony. There was the fact of the theft of the body. Some people claim that Jesus' body was actually thieved and then the disciples made the rest up. But this doesn't appear to be true either, because even the early Jewish authorities didn't believe this. They actually recognised the fact that Jesus' body had gone and said the disciples had stolen it. But yeah, the rest of the appearances and such like point to the fact that this isn't the case at all. And of course the changed lives of the disciples. And finally, that the woman went to the wrong tomb is another kind of measure used to refute this evidence. That the woman went to the wrong tomb, which is just highly unlikely, because everyone, if they did go to the wrong tomb and found an empty tomb, anyone could have gone to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea and proved that the body was still there. So the best explanation, and the most satisfying, and one which answers all objections, is the simple explanation that Jesus Christ, after he was crucified, was laid in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and that on the third day God raised him from the dead. This explains the fact that the tomb was known and would have been investigated and was found to be in fact empty. After his resurrection to life again, Jesus did appear to many people over a space of 40 days, and that these appearances, along with the earlier teachings of Jesus Christ, transformed the lives of his disciples and followers, and it also transformed the lives of many critics as well, changing their lives dramatically. We've attempted to show that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, far from being legendary, is in fact an historical fact, or is actually an historical fact. There's far more evidence than we've had time to go through, but we'd like to invite you to take a deeper look into these things and to satisfy yourself of the truth of this. And we're sure that you will, as I am and many of the Christadelphians are, will be convinced that the best explanation of all the evidence is in fact that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. Thank you very much.